"You're a useless woman." The Korean Mafia boss spat at the quiet caregiver standing beside his mother's bed. Unknown to him, she would soon become his greatest blessing. If you love slow-burn Mafia romance, hidden identities, and emotional second chances, subscribe now, like this video, and stay until the end. You won't want to miss this story. Zuri had learned, long before she ever set foot in Suho's house, that silence was often safer than explanation. She'd taken the job through a private agency that specialized in placements requiring discretion. Families who didn't ask many questions about their staff's past, so long as the staff asked none about theirs either. It suited her perfectly. She needed the work. She needed, more than anything, a life quiet enough that no one would think to look for her in it. Mrs. Han's illness had progressed quickly by the time Zuri arrived, though the older woman's spirit hadn't dimmed with it. She welcomed Zuri warmly from the very first day, patting the seat beside her bed and asking questions no one else in that house seemed interested in asking. Where she was from, what she dreamed of before life pulled her elsewhere, whether she took her tea with sugar the way she preferred it herself. Suho was rarely home in those early days, consumed by an organization that demanded every hour he wasn't sleeping. When their paths did cross, his greetings were brief, clipped, more obligation than warmth. Zuri didn't take it personally. She'd learned to read dangerous men long before she'd ever met him, and she recognized immediately the particular exhaustion behind his coldness, the kind worn by men carrying more weight than any one person should. It was 3 weeks into her employment when the first real friction surfaced. Mrs. Han had taken a turn overnight, her breathing shallow, her temperature climbing higher than Zuri liked. She'd insisted on a particular precaution, elevating his mother's position, adjusting her medication timing slightly ahead of the scheduled dose. Small adjustments, the kind she'd learned through experience Suho knew nothing about. He arrived home to find her adjusting his mother's 4-line herself, and the sight ignited something sharp and immediate in him. "What do you think you're doing?" he demanded, storming into the room. "Your mother's oxygen levels were dropping," Zuri said calmly, not looking up from her task. "I've adjusted her positioning and asked the nurse to move up her next dose." "You're not a doctor," he snapped. "You're not qualified to make decisions like that." "I know what I'm doing," she said, meeting his eyes now, steady despite the sharpness in his tone. "You're the nanny," he said, voice cold and final. "Not a nurse. Not a doctor. If something happens to her because of your interference, I hold you responsible." He turned toward the door, pausing only long enough to add, without looking back, "You're a useless woman if you think caring for her means playing doctor. Stick to your job." The words landed harder than he likely intended, though Zuri didn't let it show. She simply returned her attention to Mrs. Han, adjusting the pillow beneath her gently, her expression carefully unreadable. Mrs. Han, feigning sleep, had heard every word. By morning, Mrs. Han's fever had broken, her breathing steady, exactly as Zuri had predicted. The nurse confirmed what Zuri already knew. The adjustments had likely prevented a much more serious complication overnight. Suho said nothing about it when he came to check on his mother, though the tightness in his jaw suggested he'd been told. He didn't apologize. Zuri didn't expect him to. Life in the house settled into a careful rhythm after that. Suho remained distant, wrapped tightly in the demands of his organization, while Zuri devoted herself fully to his mother's care. Mrs. Han, sharper than her son gave her credit for, began requesting Zuri's company even outside of medical necessity, asking her to sit during meals, to help her write letters to old friends, to simply keep her company during the long afternoons when the house felt too quiet and too large. "He's not a cruel man," Mrs. Han said one afternoon, apropos of nothing, watching Zuri arrange a tray of tea. "Just a tired one. He inherited all of this before he was ready for any of it." "You don't have to explain him to me," Zuri said gently. "I'm not upset." "No," Mrs. Han said, studying her with the same sharp perceptiveness she'd shown since the first day. "But you should be. He was unkind to you, and unkindness deserves acknowledgement, even when we choose to forgive it quietly. Zuri said nothing, though something about being truly seen by the old woman settled warmly in her chest. Weeks passed into months. Suho began coming home slightly earlier some evenings. Not enough to notice at first, though his mother noticed everything. He'd linger near the kitchen when Zuri prepared his mother's meals, offering brief, awkward attempts at conversation that never quite landed naturally. Once, catching himself watching her a beat too long as she laughed at something his mother said, he cleared his throat and left the room abruptly, annoyed at himself in a way he couldn't fully explain. Zuri noticed too, though she said nothing, filing it away as simply another detail of a man she was slowly, cautiously, learning not to fear. It was nearly 6 months into her employment when Day, Suho's second-in-command, arrived at the house for the first time, his presence immediately changing the air in the room. He studied Zuri with open suspicion, the kind of assessment she recognized instantly. A man calculating threat levels out of habit. "Where did you find her?" Day asked Suho later, once Zuri had left the room. "An agency," Suho said. "Why?" "She moves careful," Day said. "Too careful for a nanny. Watches exits. Positions herself near the door in every room." He studied Suho for a long moment. "You should look into her background more closely." Suho dismissed the suggestion at the time, too consumed with organizational matters to pursue it seriously. But the observation lodged itself somewhere in the back of his mind, quiet and persistent, the way small warnings often do before they matter. He didn't yet know how right Day was, or how much it would matter. Sooner than any of them expected, the rival organization's move came without warning, the way Suho's father had always taught him the most dangerous attacks tend to. It was a quiet Tuesday evening, Suho consumed in his office 3 streets away, when 2 unfamiliar men breached the estate's outer gate under the cover of a supply delivery gone wrong. Zuri heard the disturbance before she understood what it was. A muffled struggle near the side entrance, the household staff scattering in confusion. Her instincts, the ones she'd spent years trying to bury, snapped into place instantly. She moved Mrs. Han from her bed before conscious thought caught up to her actions, guiding the frail woman toward the reinforced reading room at the end of the hall. The one room in the house with a lockable door and no windows facing the perimeter. "Stay low," she instructed calmly, her voice steady despite the adrenaline flooding through her. "Stay quiet. I need you to trust me." Mrs. Han, frightened but lucid, gripped her hand. "You know what you're doing." "I do," Zuri admitted, for the first time letting the truth surface plainly. "I need you to trust that right now more than you ever have." She barricaded the door, moving the heavy reading desk against it with strength that shouldn't have belonged to someone as slight as she appeared. When one of the intruders located the room minutes later, testing the door before attempting to force it open, Zuri positioned herself between the door and Mrs. Han, her posture shifting into something coiled and precise, entirely unlike the soft composure she usually carried. The man who eventually broke through wasn't prepared for what he found. Zuri moved with a controlled efficiency that spoke of training far beyond anything her employment file suggested. Disarming him within seconds, using his own momentum against him, subduing him just long enough to secure the door again before the second intruder arrived. By the time Suho's security team arrived, alerted by a frantic call from household staff, they found both intruders restrained, Mrs. Han shaken but entirely unharmed, and Zuri standing calmly beside her, breathing hard, blood from a shallow cut along her forearm the only visible sign of the struggle. Suho arrived minutes later, breaking every traffic law between his office and the estate, fear gripping him in a way he hadn't experienced since he was a boy watching his father bury men who'd crossed him. He found his mother first, pulling her into his arms, relief crashing through him violently. It was only afterward, straightening, that his eyes found Zuri across the room, and the full weight of what she'd done settled over him. "You did this," he said, voice unsteady, staring at her as though seeing her fully for the first time. You saved her. I did my job, Zuri said quietly, though both of them understood it had been far more than that. Day, arriving shortly after, studied the restrained intruders, then Zuri, then finally Suho, his earlier suspicions crystallizing into something closer to reluctant respect. I told you, he said simply. Too careful for a nanny. Suho barely heard him, still staring at Zuri as though the last 3 years had just rearranged themselves entirely in his mind. Every dismissive word, every cold interaction, every moment he'd underestimated the quiet woman who had, without a single word of complaint, protected the one person he loved most in the world. Who are you? He asked finally, the question carrying none of its old coldness, only something closer to disbelief. Zuri met his gaze steadily, exhaustion and old caution warring behind her eyes. Someone who used to be a lot of things, she said quietly. Before I decided I wanted to simply be safe. Days following the attack moved differently in the house. Quieter, but charged with something unspoken. Suho doubled security around the estate, questioned every member of his organization he suspected of loyalty gaps, and worked relentlessly to trace the rival group responsible. But beneath the practical urgency of it all, one truth sat heavier than the rest. He needed to understand who Zuri really was. He found her 2 nights later on the back terrace, sitting alone, a light bandage still wrapped around her forearm, watching the dark garden with the same quiet composure she always carried, though something in her posture seemed lighter now, as if setting down a weight she'd carried far too long. You don't have to tell me anything, he said, sitting across from her, though the words cost him more than he expected. I have no right to ask, considering how I treated you. Zuri studied him for a long moment before answering. I was a field medic, she said finally. Overseas, for a private security contractor. I saw things I don't talk about. Lost people I couldn't save, despite everything I was trained to do. She paused, old grief flickering briefly across her face. I left that life behind because I couldn't carry it anymore. I wanted something quiet, something where I wasn't responsible for anyone's life hanging in the balance. And instead you ended up here, Suho said quietly. In a house more dangerous than you could have imagined. Ironic, isn't it? She said, the faintest hint of a tired smile touching her lips. Suho sat with that for a long moment, the weight of the past 3 years settling uncomfortably over him. I called you useless, he said finally, voice rough with something he rarely let himself feel. The day I met you, and more times after that than I'd like to admit. I judged you before I ever bothered to understand you. You were exhausted and frightened for your mother, Zuri said. I understood, even then. That doesn't excuse it, he said firmly. You saved her life. Twice now, in a way. Once quietly, every single day you cared for her, and once when it mattered more than anything else ever has. He looked at her fully now, something unguarded breaking through the hardness he usually wore like armor. I don't know how to make up for 3 years of underestimating you. Zuri considered him for a long moment, old caution warring with something new and unfamiliar stirring quietly beneath it. You could start, she said softly, by not doing it again. He almost smiled at that. A rare, unguarded thing that softened the sharp lines of his face entirely. I don't think I could if I tried, he admitted. Not anymore. They sat together in comfortable silence after that, the tension of the last few days finally easing into something calmer, steadier, though neither of them spoke yet of the quiet shift settling between them. Weeks passed. The organization stabilized, the rival threat neutralized through careful, deliberate work Suho no longer hid from Zuri, treating her now as someone whose judgment he trusted rather than dismissed. Mrs. Han recovered fully, her fondness for Zuri deepening into something like the daughter she'd always wanted, teasing her son relentlessly about the way his eyes followed Zuri around every room he entered. One evening months after the attack, Suho found Zuri in the kitchen, laughing softly at something his mother had said, the warm domestic ease of the scene settling over him unexpectedly. He lingered in the doorway longer than he meant to, watching her the way he'd caught himself doing more and more often lately, and it struck him plainly, almost against his will, that somewhere in the last 3 years, the woman he'd once dismissed so easily had become the person he could no longer imagine his life without. "You're staring again," Zuri said without turning, a knowing smile tugging at her lips. "I know," he said simply, stepping into the room instead of retreating the way he once might have. Mrs. Han excused herself with a knowing look neither of them missed, leaving the two of them alone in the quiet kitchen. "I've been thinking," Suho said, uncharacteristically nervous, "about what happens now. Not with the organization. With this. Us." Zuri turned to face him fully, searching his expression for the coldness that once defined him and finding none of it left. "And what have you decided?" "I don't want you to just be someone who works in this house anymore," he said quietly. "I want you to stay because you choose to. Because of me, not despite me." For the first time since she'd arrived, Zuri let herself set down the last of her guardedness fully. "Then ask me properly," she said softly. He stepped closer, something unfamiliar and hopeful breaking fully across his face. "Stay," he said simply. "Not as my mother's caretaker. As mine." Zuri smiled, warm and certain, closing the last of the distance between them. "I suppose," she said, "someone has to keep watching your exits for you." He laughed, a real, unguarded sound, and kissed her softly, the 3 years of misjudgment finally settling into something neither of them regretted anymore.